Hello, everyone. Welcome to DILAN Delivers, a free webinar series sponsored by DILAN Consulting Group in San Francisco, California. Today's topic is, what can design thinking teach your organization? Featuring Dr. Robin Beers. My name is Paul Bayonne. I am a senior consultant at DILAN. I'll be your online host today. Oops, and let's get this slideshow moving. Here we go. All right. Let me begin with a brief description of DILAN Consulting Group. We are a team of psychologists who work with organizations to build their leadership and team capabilities. Our motto is business is human. The way we see it, our clients are experts in their field of business, and we at DILAN are experts about people and about understanding and shaping their behavior. When we merge these expertise domains together, that collaboration helps leaders, teams, and individuals unleash the human potential that enables their organizations to thrive. The goal of our free DILAN Delivers webinars is to present content that you might find both interesting and helpful in your and your organization's work efforts. We're recording this video for this webinar for posting on DILAN's YouTube channel. You will receive an email from us with a link to this recording, as well as a link to a feedback survey about this webinar. On your Zoom screen, let's get rid of that, you should see both a chat button and a Q&A button. I'll be monitoring any questions that you submit via either of these two functions, and then posing your questions to our presenters either during the webinar or near its end, depending on how the conversation is proceeding. With that, let me go ahead and introduce today's presenters, Dr. Robin Beers, and today's moderator discussant, Dr. Eugene DeLon. Dr. Beers is a globally recognized design leader who has led and inspired organizations of all sizes for the past 20 years. She is currently Director of Research at Workday, leading a team that utilizes insights about users to help drive better design and business decisions. Prior to joining Workday, she led the design and research teams on the retail and business-to-business sides of Wells Fargo Bank for 18 years. Prior to her work in the tech sector, she consulted to organizations in the diversity, equity, and inclusion arenas. She views the tools of design and research to be catalysts for organizational change. Dr. Eugene DeLon has been 25 years as a clinical psychologist and international consultant. For about a decade, he was working international consulting throughout Europe, Asia, and the United States. And then 11.5 years ago, launched DILAN Consulting Group, where he has been putting his business as human approach into everyday active practice with us, his team of consultants. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and drop out of my appearance here, stopping sharing my screen, and I'm going to let Eugene and Robin take it away.
Hello, Robin.
Hello. I'm so excited to be here with you, Dr. DeLon.
And I'm so happy to have you here, Dr. Beers. To anybody who doesn't know, Robin and I have been friends for 20-something years, probably about 30, and we are family. And those of you who know me well also know that business is human is a term that Robin evolved through her own business and then gifted to us when we were talking about starting a company. She said, well, this is you. And so I'm not using it. And so anyway, here she is. And she has been a great champion, great supporter of me and the work that we do. And I'm so pleased to have her here because in a lot of ways, this topic of user-centered design is at the heart of the work that we do. Ultimately, I think that people on the user side, they know what people sitting in management don't know. They live it every day. And so she's going to share with us a lot of great information today. And really, I'm going to fade to the background and occasionally fade in to just ask a question or have her go a little bit deeper on something that I think will be of value. And then at the end, she and I will take some questions, but mostly it'll be her with me being there as her champion this time. So thank you for joining us. And I know you're going to find this useful and helpful and inspiring. So with that, Robin, I'm going to turn it over to you and I'm going to mute myself.
Awesome. Great. And I know Paul is listening and maybe wondering if the live broadcast is going on LinkedIn. It doesn't seem to be, but I did drop the link to the Zoom in the chat. So hopefully people will make their way to us. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. One moment, and we'll get into it. Let me just get into slideshow mode here. So what can design thinking teach organizations or businesses about themselves and about the problems they're trying to solve? We're going to get into how applying the mindsets and techniques of design can really help you in this crazy world we're living in. So we've been talking about living in a VUCA environment for well over a decade, and VUCA is an acronym spelled out there as describing the environment that we're living in as volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. I think we can all agree, like, even if we are new to this concept, we've all gone to a master class on this concept over the last 2 years of living through a pandemic. And so, for many years, though, organizations, businesses, social agencies, et cetera, have been trying to come up with strategies and techniques to adapt to a constantly changing circumstances that are affecting all of us in all areas of our lives and the planet as a whole. So, separation between what's good for business, what's good for people, what is good for the planet is dissolving. But how did we get here? And why is it so hard for many organizations to see that they are a part of an overall system? So in part, we can trace this separation back to Milton Friedman, who is a Nobel Peace Prize winning economist. And he wrote a paper that was published in 1976. This is what he won the prize for. And the main tenet, and I think even the title, was the social responsibility of business is to increase profits, full stop. And this ushered in an era of shareholder primacy. So the interests of shareholders and making profits is elevated over the interests of anything else, and everything else will work itself out. So this ethos really continues to drive motives, decisions, and actions of most Fortune 500 companies today. And so, what's interesting is 1976 in some ways doesn't seem that long ago. And in another way, it seems forever ago. And these conclusions that he came to around, privileging shareholder primacy over all other interests, it really belongs to a stable, predictable world that we don't live in anymore. That he came out with this premise before we started talking about VUCA environments. And so the result is what I often refer to as an industrial era hangover. And the symptoms of this industrial era hangover are, slow, bureaucratic, overly complex, siloed, hierarchical organizations. It's extremely difficult to innovate in a state of disassociation and disconnection from what the actual realities are on the planet. But the ice is starting to crack. And this is a statement put out in, as you can see, 2019 by the Business Roundtable, which is a consortium of Fortune 500 CEOs that since 1978 had aligned their principles to Milton Friedman's premise of shareholder primacy above all else. But in 2019, they moved into a new statement that broke this norm. And the new statement outlines a modern standard for corporate responsibility. So the Business Roundtable redefines the purpose of a corporation to promote an economy that serves all Americans. Radical idea. I'm going to read a little bit from two different CEOs that signed this statement. This is from Jamie Dimon, who's the chairman and CEO of JP Morgan Chase. The American dream is alive but fraying. Major employers are investing in their workers and communities because they know it is the only way to be successful over the long term. These modernized principles reflect the business community's unwavering commitment to continue to push for an economy that serves all Americans. You can argue about whether that's happening, but again, it is, the cracking of the ice of shareholder primacy. Here's another statement.
Robin, what I might say about that quote is that it's interesting that it's so American focused when we're talking about global companies that have a footprint everywhere. And so even that statement I would challenge. And my hope is that eventually we're thinking about all stakeholders wherever they sit. So it's
wherever they are on the planet.
Exactly.
You're totally right. Absolutely. It is very American centric. And, there's so many good books around the American dream and how that's never really been attainable to every single person in this country, let alone this world. So obviously take what CEOs of Fortune 500s take with a grain of salt. But I want to just read a couple more quotes here that you can scan yourself from other CEOs who I think are making strides in this in this arena of corporate social responsibility and multi-stakeholder focus. So Mark Benioff of Salesforce says, companies can do more than just make money. They can serve others. The business of business is improving the state of the world. So to Eugene's point, more of a global focus. And Larry Fink of BlackRock, society is demanding that companies, both public and private, serve a social purpose. To prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, so of course, shareholder wealth is still there, it's still a business, but also show how it makes positive contribution to society. Companies must benefit all of their stakeholders, including shareholders, employees, customers, and the communities in which they operate. And then this, just hot off the press from Patagonia's founder, they announced last week on September 15th that instead of going public, they are giving their company to their foundation, and they're turning over all of the wealth in the company to this foundation that's valued at around $3 billion to the Patagonia Purpose Trust and Holdfast Collective. And in the words of Yvonne Chouinard, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, I'm probably not, but we are making the earth our only shareholder. So they're an extreme and very inspirational example of the shift that we're seeing. So what does this have to do with design thinking? I'm going to tell you what design thinking is in just a second, but right now I want to emphasize that in the environment in which we're living, where things are no longer stable and predictable, and it's not just about control, it's not just about shareholder value, organizations need to develop new capabilities that will help them to navigate complexity and the rapid change characterized by a VUCA world. So here's the cover of Harvard Business Review. I think this is from 2015, and they devoted a whole issue to design thinking and pointing out that it's not just about driving design strategy, it's about driving business strategy, managing change in the organization, and really just straight up problem solving in a complex world where we don't know the answers ahead of time. The little honeycomb diagram is from Stanford Design School, Stanford D School. And this is kind of the generic steps of the design thinking process. But what I want to also iterate or emphasize here is that it's about iteration. It's about not a one and done approach, but refining over time. It's about empathy. It's about putting yourself into the shoes of all of the stakeholders that you're trying to solve for and making sure that you're aware of what their needs are and what the consequences of different solutions might be upon them. It's about challenging assumptions. You know, so many businesses, organizations can get really kind of calcified in their point of view and the assumptions that they hold. And design thinking within it contains processes and techniques for really opening up those assumptions and considering and inviting in other viewpoints. And it really, yes.
I was just going to say that the idea of challenging assumptions, this is where I think diversity can really help, because when you have people with different lived experiences in the room, you can begin, I think, to challenge those assumptions in a way that's, I think, more strategic or more targeted. So I'll just leave that.
Yeah.
There.
And I love this quote by Steve Jobs: design isn't about the way it looks, it's about the way it works. And you can apply this quote to anything. I was working with an individual at my previous organization, and the question was, how do we support more African Americans having access to mortgages to buy their first home? And so if you look at the way the system has been designed in terms of, you know, including or excluding certain types of buyers from the home ownership market, you can see that, you know, the way that it is working now is the way that it was designed. So if you want it to be designed differently, or if you want it to work differently, you have to design it to work differently. So it's not about aesthetics. It's about applying the principles of design to the way people work. So here, this is a great cartoon that I found that I think really just drives home the notion that we are surrounded by complexity. And yet within the walls of our organizations, we're still using tools that assume kind of a simple A to B, you know, input, output formula. But these simple formulas no longer work. I had the great fortune of working with Tom Chi about a decade ago. He was the former head of Google's Google X Lab, which is the innovation arm of Google. Yes, he was involved in the Google Glass infamy. But while there, he developed a methodology of rapid prototyping. And I was fortunate enough to learn that method with him. And during our time together, he said this really important thing, which is, okay, so in a VUCA world, in a unpredictable, complex environment, we can't control much. But what we can control is how quickly we learn. And that goes back, Eugene, to, you know, challenging assumptions. This front part, knowing is the enemy of learning. If we go into situations that we've never encountered before, feeling like we have to know the answer, that is a barrier to challenging our own assumptions and learning.
Robin,
So
if I might add, the other thing I think that could be helpful in this VUCA world, again, I think what he said there in terms of learning being the only thing, but the other thing that I think about is values. If we can know what our values are, those can also help to inform how we move through this craziness. So,
yeah, definitely. I think values, but I would say over the past 2.5 years, my personal values, well, maybe they haven't like outright changed, they've shifted a lot, you know, in terms of what I'm willing to do for work, what I'm willing to do, you know, socially, what I'm willing to stand up for versus what I might have been quiet about before. And that, came from the direct experience of navigating the pandemic. So usually when we read or hear about design thinking, we think about experiences like online experiences or products, or interfaces. But I really want to emphasize that the techniques, the process is output agnostic, and you can apply them to anything that you want to intentionally design: conversations, policies, processes, operations. So design thinking starts with understanding the problem space, and spending time problem framing is critical. What is the right problem to solve? So let's talk about how to approach it. This is probably the most famous design thinking diagram depicting the most important concept of design thinking. It's called the double diamond for obvious reasons, and it originated from the UK Design Council. And what the two diamonds represent are processes of exploring an issue more widely, divergent, and deeply, and then taking a focused action, convergent thinking. And so the whole process, it feels very different than that complexity cartoon with the input of A is the output of B. This is about, okay, let's open our aperture, let's go very wide and diverge so that we can create a lot of data, a lot of possibilities, a lot of choices that we might be able to work with before we converge and sort of put things together in new ways and consider unique solutions. So, a lot of people, especially people in businesses who are valued for their expertise and for, getting stuff done, can sometimes have a hard time, dwelling in this diverge space. But really challenge yourself and your teams, your organization to do this so that you have as much material to learn with at your disposal. So let's take an example, or let's just build this template. This is called a problem tree diagram, and DILAN Consulting uses this with their clients. So you might have a presenting problem, and you might talk about this problem in terms of, well, what are the effects that this problem is causing? What are the other symptoms that we can see? And then you'll want to go deeper. Well, why, what are the root causes that we think might be occurring because of this presenting problem? Because you want to get to those root causes and problem solve on those rather than just defaulting to the presenting problem. So here's an example. There could be a nice residential neighborhood that suddenly started experiencing a huge influx of traffic that they didn't have previously. And the effects of this were, the neighborhood was less safe. It wasn't safe for pedestrians. There was frustrated drivers, like road rage, an increase maybe in pollution, both noise and air. And so what could be some of the root causes for this? Well, you could look at it like, so has the population in this neighborhood increased significantly? Is there like a bunch of new housing? Did routes of public transportation get disrupted or discontinued? Is there like a big construction project going on that is now routing people differently? Are there things going on with technology that might be disrupting the traffic, technological changes in the neighborhood? So this is how you frame a problem based on more than just the presenting problem. So we've diverged on the problem and converged on a problem statement. And now we want to explore possible solutions. What type of future might we want to create? So here is another tool of the trade of design thinking, which is called the how might we statement, or some people refer to it as an acronym, HMW. And really, this is a very powerful thing to do, which is to take a problem statement and reframe it as a question. This concept is simple but powerful because by framing the problem as a question, we invite curiosity. We recognize that we don't have the answers, and that we will collaboratively learn forward through exploring multiple approaches. So a very different mindset than, we think about organizations mechanistically, and there's inputs and there's outputs and it's predictable and we can control it. This invites curiosity, reflection, experimentation. And what I think that design thinking has evolved into recently, with much more focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, is to add the question, and at what cost? Because we're trying to look at problems systemically, both in terms of their effects, their root causes on all stakeholders in the system. And so we don't just want to envision a world where we can do something for some people that has a cost to others and the planet. So let me give you an example. Going back to the presenting problem of a neighborhood that's suddenly getting a huge influx of traffic. This is an actual photo that I took from a news story from a newspaper in New Jersey. This is a New Jersey suburb. And suddenly they were having just streams of cars go through during commuting hours. And they'd never had that in their quiet neighborhood before. And one woman quoted in the article said, my son, who's a teenager, has to go out into the street with an orange cone and put the orange cone out there just so the mom can back out of the driveway and they can go to school and work. So completely changing the character of the neighborhood. So what happened to cause this problem? So if we go back to our problem tree diagram, the presenting problem was traffic, and we brainstormed these effects and these root causes. And earlier when I said, well, what about technology? What about you might have been like, I don't know why that would be a factor. But in fact, the punchline of this story is yes. What happened was that wayfinding apps like Google Maps, Waze, etc., their question was, how might we quickly get commuters or drivers from point A to point B, causing traffic jams and a real change in neighborhood, quality of life as an unintended consequence. And so you can see here in this example that nobody asked the question, at what cost? And the how might we question only applied to a sliver of the stakeholder ecosystem, not to all the stakeholders in the system. So a revised how might we question might be, how might we help commuters get where they're going efficiently while ensuring that our neighborhoods are safe for children to play and pleasant to live in? It's a different question than how might we get people from point A to point B. So in designing, there's a large amount of responsibility and ethical considerations that must be taken into account. So once we feel that we have framed the right problem to consider all in the ecosystem, we are now ready to get into more specifics about the future we envision. And a great way to succinctly do this is through creating today, tomorrow diagrams. So if you're working in your organization on a problem where you know what the present state is, and you can clarify what are the pain points or what are the disadvantages of staying within this state, then individually, I really like to do this as an individual exercise, not as a group exercise. and I'll say more about that in a sec, but then you can start shifting to, okay, what would a different tomorrow, a new situation be like? How can you describe that solution, and how can you, account for the key shifts that would that would ameliorate the key pain points in the today's situation? And the reason why I like to do this separately is to Eugene's point earlier when he said that diversity is a key component of challenging assumptions. It's important and a tenet of design thinking to honor different ways of knowing, of different ways of communicating. And so that includes building in exercises where individuals can do heads down thinking before they have to share out into the broader group. So if I were facilitating this, I would give everybody 15 minutes or whatever the allotted time was to create these diagrams, and then we would share them. And then likely after that, we would start going around and maybe putting colored dots on aspects of people's tomorrow diagrams that we find particularly compelling, and then combining those in different unique ways to come up with a common vision. And what this all leads to, what is the real goal of using design thinking techniques for problem solving in organizations, is that this alignment occurs and everyone steps into a creative, curious mode to learn forward together. And it really lowers the anxiety. It's a completely different space to be in, involved in activities that are helping you stitch ideas together, go wide, then narrow, admit you don't have the answers, than it is to try to, convince people that your point of view is right. And so together through conscious collaboration, so having those heads down times, as well as those times to talk as a group, and having structured time-bound activities, we can create future state experiences while standing firmly in the present. So we slice off a piece of the future. And how we do that is through prototyping. This is one of my most favorite quotes because it so viscerally captures why experimenting, piloting, and getting feedback are important. So Frank Lloyd Wright, you can use an eraser on the drafting table or a sledgehammer on the construction site. And what prototyping offers us is the eraser. What prototyping also does is force us to think through our cognitive concepts visually. And this pushes our thinking forward individually and in a group discussion. And so I encourage you all to, think of the world as made up of triangles, squares, and circles. Anybody can draw. You can see these are not beautiful drawings here. But when you have to actually walk through an experience or a process or a workshop, that you're designing, and you visually depict it, that helps you to think of things that you wouldn't think through if you were just discussing it. So prototypes allow us to slice off a piece of the future, test and learn and refine the idea. So in summary, these are the key points I want to leave you with. These are, organizations need new capabilities to learn and adapt faster. The VUCA aspect of our world doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. So recognizing that learning velocity is the only thing we can control, and setting up activities, opportunities to increase that learning velocity. Problem framing is key to navigating complexity. What problem are we trying to solve, and why, and how might we? Seeking the right questions before the right answers. And alignment. Alignment is the byproduct of conscious collaboration. No teams that I know of are working, as islands or individuals. It's all around understanding the exchanges we are making across a whole ecosystem of stakeholders and how to align around, our responsibilities and our inputs to come up with something bigger than the sum of its parts. And then prototyping and testing solutions mitigates risk. You don't want to use that sledgehammer on the construction site. You want the opportunity for that eraser time. And so with that, I will stop sharing my screen and open the conversation up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robin. The simplicity of that and yet the depth of it is amazing, because I do think that sometimes we over-engineer things and sometimes we make it inaccessible. But what you just did is something that anyone can think through. And that is why I love when you talked about the triangles and the squares and the circles, because I do think that sometimes we get in our own way rather than thinking about the simplest way of communicating something. And then I think we end up censoring, which is, again, why I think pictures are so important, because you actually move your thinking brain to the other side, and you tap into a part of yourself that you normally don't use, because that analytic brain has that voice that begins to censor. So I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. One of them is, how did you end up doing this kind of work? And I'm going to open it up, and Paul's going to read some questions, but how'd you end up doing this kind of work?
So it all goes back to reading an article, I think in the New York Times, called Anthropologists in the Corporate Jungle. And it was written by an author named Katie Hafner. She's a great writer and journalist. She's actually married to Bob Wachter, Dr. Bob, the coronavirus expert. Yeah, they're married. So she wrote this article, and it was like describing, people like me who have, a bunch of social science training and background, and they, were describing people who are being hired by corporations to understand how people actually use technology and how to make it more suitable for real humans instead of, computers. So that's how I got into it. But as you know, because Eugene was the one who told me, 30 years ago, you should do a PhD in organizational psychology. And I was like, I didn't know what that was. So I said, okay. And then I did it because he told me to. But so I always have brought the organizational lens to the work. And to me, it's just very clear that the processes of diverging before you converge, asking questions before you bring a solution, are things that are very, very applicable to solving all problems in organizations, and especially organizational development.
What I love about the defining the problem and looking at the effects and all of that is that it really does shift the conversation. In my work, I'm often called in because people are in conflict. And part of the reason that they're in conflict is because they show up with a way, and my way is the right way. And then it becomes like a little bit of a pissing party, instead of really trying to understand and go deeper in terms of defining. It becomes an ego thing. So yeah. With that, I wanted to ask you about empathy, because I think that everything that you talked about really is about bringing empathy to the work that you're doing in terms of understanding others and the need and the problem. And I actually think that sometimes too much of this is actually getting in the way of kind of building that empathy muscle in people. So can you speak to empathy a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, empathy is at the heart of, what I do as a research leader. But it took me a long time to realize that while I had a lot of empathy for our end customers, our consumers of our products and services, I didn't necessarily have a lot of empathy for my colleagues and partners. So there was a lot of like, well, engineering, they always say no. And, that's why we can't innovate and, product, like they just care about like delivering features and not the right thing and so forth. And so what I really love about bringing people together to work in a design thinking way is that first of all, it democratizes hierarchy because everybody's doing the same exercises. And the second thing is that people are not coming just with their, with their subject matter expertise and there to prove, that they're smart or they have the right answers. We start focusing on the questions and the problems, and then people bring their different points of view to that. I'll just tell a quick story. I was facilitating a workshop once that was around significantly shortening the application process for small businesses to be able to take credit cards, so merchant services. And we were going around doing, introductions, your name, your role, and what's your one hope for the day. And there's one woman sitting in the back, arms crossed, and she's like, my one hope for the day is that nothing bad happens. And my role is that I'm an underwriter. So her point of view is I am here to make sure that we don't get into trouble by, not having a part of the underwriting process, be cut out. That should be there for legal reasons and compliance and so forth. But it was amazing to see her over the course of the day be inspired and be a part of, well, how might we, significantly shorten this credit services application in a way that is mindful of the concerns of underwriting, the concerns of, technical feasibility from engineers, designers, et cetera. So I think that, long-winded answer, empathy is something that happens in collaboration. And if you consciously design that collaboration to account for different ways of thinking, different styles, different functional areas of expertise, and different hierarchical levels, you can come to amazing shared understanding that's a lot more satisfying and for people than jockeying to debate and sell their perspective.
Well, I love that story because in a lot of ways it speaks to empathy, but it also speaks to creating space. That in the creative process, we do bring different lenses based on our lived experiences. And we often, I think, can be too quick to discount someone's perspective when she probably added all kinds of value.
Right.
It's a question of timing,
Yeah. Right.
but you need
like,
someone.
Oh, don't invite the underwriter. Like, no, the beginning was the perfect time to invite the underwriter.
That's right. Yeah. So I'm wondering if Paul has any questions, but I also wanted to ask you, and Paul, you can chime in here, but I'm gonna ask a question, and then I'm gonna create some space for you if there's any questions in the chat. But,
yeah, I saw a couple good ones come through.
Yes, there is, but go ahead, Eugene.
Just one. A lot of organizations are struggling with this hybrid thing, and you and I have talked about it a little bit, and we know that some companies say this is working over there, let's just copy it. So can you say a little bit about how a process like this could actually help organizations around that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely no one size fits all, and what works at company A may not work at company B for a variety of reasons. And so I think, it's something as controversial as like returning to the office and how that's going to work. It's critical to involve people in that process. And my current company, Workday, did that. They ran workshops and sort of like a hackathon style of like, okay, what will this look like? And really, what they settled on was that it's about flexibility and retaining what people valued in the pandemic, which is that their life had a lot more flow and blend and flexibility, but also that there's value in coming together for moments that matter, collaboration and so forth. Now, is it perfect? Like, no, we're going back to the office on October 3rd. And I think there's a lot of us who are like terrified about that and how that's all going to work. But the emphasis again has been on we're going to experiment, we're going to iterate, we're going to take in feedback, we're going to understand people's need to feel in charge of their own schedule. But there's still like a lot of unknowns, like, okay, well, if you're having to collaborate with people in Ireland, you only have 2 hours a day to do that. And if you're commuting to work, well, then when's that gonna, so there's a lot of unknowns, but I think it's about saying there is no one right answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And again, I can't say enough about the iterating and how we need to strengthen that muscle, because so many people are seeking perfection, and that gets in the way of good enough and gets in the way of let's experiment and see how it goes and then learn from that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul. And Paul, I see questions are coming in, so please share them with us.
Will do. The first question, actually, it's a series of comments, very insightful comments, culminating in a question from Hans. And Hans writes, I don't think that the business roundtable statement that you referenced earlier in your presentation goes far enough. This statement is unclear and ambiguous. The CEO of Patagonia's statement is far more on target. Quote, nature is now our only shareholder. Hans goes on, we don't have time to be unclear to make incremental changes. He makes other comments, Hans does, about how, the earth must now be our highest priority. Organizations and business must learn to live in harmony with nature. Here's his question. I believe we must rethink the design of organizations entirely. How might such design concepts and principles help us to do this?
I don't know. No. Hans, I think you make excellent points. And I think we do need to look at, beyond the walls of MBA programs for how to create sustainable, regenerative organizations. Eugene and I were in East Africa together a year or so ago in Kenya. And as we were driving around the savannah with our guide, looking at animals, we were talking about how incredible the, symbiosis of different species are, where, little birds eat the bugs off the water buffalo, and that's how they get nutrients. And that's how the water buffalo stays healthy. And then the poop of some other animal ends up, pollinating these trees that this animal needs to eat, and so forth. And I think, you're right. The statement, the business roundtable statement, does not go nearly far enough. And plus, like, who knows if these CEOs really believe it, in their heart of hearts. But we need bigger questions. And one of my other talks, I talk about, that user-centered design is no longer enough. It has to be society-centered design. And that Waze or Google Maps, whatever example of that neighborhood getting congested with traffic, is a small example like that of like, how do we think bigger about, how to save this planet that we're all living on from not being able to survive because of our emphasis on profits over the environment, over people.
Just what I would add, just one tiny little piece that I think you touched, but I want to just underscore it, that we need to include more stakeholders, because the business roundtable was the business perspective and the business lens. And so the minute you begin to introduce other stakeholders, you're already beginning to broaden the lens. And so more people involved is really what it's going to take, which goes right to what you said, society-centered design. And so how do you do that? By including stakeholders in society. So,
and to Hans's part about, like, I believe we must rethink the design of organizations entirely. I mean, many organizations on paper look like hierarchies, org chart hierarchies. And that may be the reporting structure. But in the terms of the way that work is really getting done, that is not how work is getting done. Work is getting done in multifunctional, multidisciplinary teams. And there's still, I think, very little understanding inside of organizations about how to really harness that power of the network effect versus the org chart hierarchy.
You just answered my question that I was going to ask, is how do you now take the stakeholder concept internal to the organizations and amongst those teams, amongst those, where do they harness their power to be able to influence the decision makers, or are they co-decision makers along with the power structure to be able to make some of these changes now happen? The workforce is getting quote unquote younger and more global and interconnected in how they're thinking. How do they then take that influence and impact upon the power structure that be in order to make those changes happen? That's what you just spoke to. So there goes my question and answer in one fell swoop. We do have another question that came in from Audrey.
Yeah.
Robin, do you have any tips for ensuring that the insights and ideas that come out of a design thinking process, quote unquote, have legs? And how do they end up having an impact beyond what happens within the process?
Mm-hmm. Yes, excellent question. I would say that there's a couple things. I mean, it depends on what you're designing, but if you're designing web experiences, then I think the typical thing is to create a prototype that's higher fidelity than what came out of drawing on paper, and to start socializing that prototype. If it's more around an organizational change or a process, I think, again, codifying the convergence that happened with the group is important. Sharing that out, continuing to get feedback, and then going into an action stage, like what is an experiment that we could run? What is a small, pilot that we could do in order to, further experiment with this idea, develop it, refine it? Because we don't want to just crumple up all this paper and post-it notes at the end and move on. So it does need a champion and somebody who's accountable. And then the last thing I'll say about that is that could be multiple people, and leaving space in workshops for okay, we, made these agreements. And so let's draw up a grid here on the whiteboard or mural or Miro or whatever, and say, these are the actions that we'll take, by when, and who's going to push that forward. I think that that's really important to build in accountability.
And what I like about the word champion, which is exactly the word that I use with my clients, is that that's different than being a leader and saying you're the person who's ultimately responsible for all of it. I like the word champion because I think you're responsible for making sure that the people who need to get together to, it's a slightly different point of view. The other thing that I say is throw away nothing, because just because an idea doesn't work today, the world is changing so quickly that sometimes you might want to revisit some of those old ideas and mine for something that at that time, given the circumstances, maybe wasn't a good idea, but maybe 6 months, a year later, might actually be perfect in terms of what the situation might be.
Yeah. Yep. Information context changes all the time. Yeah.
Any other questions, Paul?
No other questions have come in. We do have some comments, though. People are saying 100% agree, 100% yes. So this is apparently resonating with our audience, which is a nice thing to hear. But if you do have members of the audience, if you do have questions, now's the time. Pop it in the chat, and we will address it right away.
I'll just read what Hans put in the chat because I love it. From a Zen perspective, everything in our world is entirely connected and interdependent, yet we have not honored our relationship and dependence on nature. Yes, profits can no longer be the focus of business if we hope to make the changes we need to make. Society-centered organizational design feels kind of right, But I think in a way, that is where we have been focusing only on people. We must now focus on the entire connected world and view of ourselves as part of nature, not nature as some resource factory, but we were made to take advantage of. Not only humans are capable of making such change, not sure humans are capable of making such change, honestly, given the ongoing greed, focus on self, and desire to control others. But yeah, I agree, Hans, this is the shift that we have to make. And you're right, society-centered design isn't quite the same thing either. It's like, it's all living things, and I'd put rocks and oceans and, people and animals in that, and trees, and, and that's a big shift. But as I said at the beginning, we've been going to school, not just on VUCA, but interconnection as well. There's nothing more sort of visceral than thinking, oh my God, the air I breathe might be getting myself and others sick. And so that is interconnection.
I want to say that just the thought of trying to figure out where to start to move through the world with a lens of interconnection is overwhelming. And what I would say, again, I agree with that, but it feels overwhelming. And so I guess I wonder, I'm going to pose a question to you, Robin. How do you think one might go about doing that? If you're going to broaden that lens, what might be a place to start?
Well, I think that's, it's a very big question, and it gets down to values and how you see, yourself as located in the world. As you know, I talk a lot about the philosophy of Ubuntu, which is a Zulu word that translated means I am because we are. And at its heart, the idea of humanity, humanness, is relational, that you cannot even experience or be human yourself unless you recognize the humanity in others. So that's where I start. I don't know.
Robin, with those words, I'm going to bring this to a close, except to add one little bit that maybe we need to start shifting from a lens of scarcity to a lens of abundance, because I think that sometimes is what drives the I'm going to get mine while there's still some to get. But again, your words have been incredible. I can't say how much I appreciate your being here and sharing with us all of the knowledge that you have from all of the experience that you've had over the years. Thank you, and I hope you will come back and visit with us again. And I'll just say I'm going to turn it over to Paul to close up.
Thank you very much. So what I'm going to do here is wrap up by saying thank you to both of our presenters today. Robin, a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. We're getting lots of applause coming through the chat here. Eugene, thank you for your moderation and your questions. We're wrapping up. If you need to get a hold of us here at DILAN Consulting Group, here is our contact information. We are available all the time to help you and your organizations address issues like this and the other issues that you think we might be of service to you in regards to change management, organization development, coaching, you name it. We do it here at DILAN Consulting. So with that, I will say thank you for attending this past hour with us. Again, be looking in your email over the next day or so. You will be getting a survey through the email, as well as a link to the YouTube posting of this entire broadcast. Thank you very much and have a good day.